Welcome to Chapter 13 of Anatomy and Physiology, and with this chapter we're just continuing on through the nervous system. So in Chapter 12 you heard all the microscopic anatomy and all the microscopic of physiology. Well, now we're going to do the organs, the macroscopic anatomy. And we're going to start off first with the central nervous system. Remember, your central nervous system is made up of two organs. It's the brain up top and then your spinal cord. And in this chapter, we're going to focus on just one of those two organs. We're going to focus on your spinal cord. So as we go through this chapter, we're going to do our usual. We're going to break down the anatomy of the spinal cord, see all the different parts and what they look like. And then we'll, like usual, break down the physiology. And when it comes to the spinal cord, like most other organs, your spinal cord does a lot of things. For one, it's really your spinal cord's job to process reflexes. Think when you touch a hot stove, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to automatically pull away from that hot stove. That's actually a type of reflex. Or think when you go to the doctor and your doctor taps you on the knee and you kick out. That's a reflex as well. Turns out these reflexes are actually the result of processing of information just in the spinal cord. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you touched the hot stove and you had to process that reflex information in the brain, that would actually take slightly longer than your usual reflex. And you might have the possibility to override your brain. Because remember, you are mainly your brain. So if you were to touch your hot stove and rely on the brain to process it, well, you might actually have to think about it. And usually when someone has to think about stuff, well, they're going to slow down. So having reflexes be processed in the spinal cord actually helps you to process the information a little bit faster, not having to send it that far. So this is one of the functions of the spinal cord. It's to process reflexes. Not only is it processing reflexes, it's also processing or integrating other types of information. Turns out, your spinal cord helps to process excitatory postsynaptic potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. Remember, EPSP is an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Remember, this is when a cell has received an excitatory signal and it's depolarized and gotten closer to threshold. Turns out the spinal cord can help to process some of this information. Same thing for an IPSP. Remember, that's an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Remember, this is when a cell receives a signal that's inhibiting it, telling it to stop doing something. And you remember when you're exhibiting an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, you're going to hyperpolarize, become more negative, and move away from threshold. That way you don't make an action potential and you don't do anything because you've been told to stop by that inhibitory signal. So again, just processing this information, bringing them both together, integrating them, kind of thinking summation. Remember, during summation, a neuron could receive multiple signals, and they'll exhibit either inhibitory or excitatory postsynaptic potentials that they could integrate. Turns out that's occurring largely in the spinal cord. It's integrating a lot of those signals. And then one last simple thing is the last function listed here is really what people usually think about the spinal cord. People usually think of the spinal cord as a highway of information. You're either sending sensory information to the brain or sending motor information away from the brain. And again, it usually makes sense. When you touch a hot stove, well, you're really noticing it's hot thanks to the receptors, aka neurons in your skin. And they'll have to send that information to neurons in your nerves, which will send that sensory information to neurons in your spinal cord, which will send that sensory information on up to the brain. And vice versa for motor, or the opposite for motor. If I want to walk to a door, well, again, it's going to begin with neurons in my brain that are going to have to send that motor information to neurons in my spinal cord, which will send that motor information to neurons closer to my muscles and my nerves, and my neurons in my nerves will talk to my muscle cells. So at one point, you could just think literally of the spinal cord as a highway for information. Either sending sensory information to the brain or sending motor information away from the brain towards your muscles. So your spinal cord actually does a lot. And like I mentioned earlier, we're just going to break down the anatomy of the spinal cord and again, get into a little bit more detail on that physiology. How does the spinal cord do those major functions? So we're going to begin our journey again by breaking down the anatomy of the spinal cord. And it turns out if I wanted to look at someone's spinal cord, I'm going to have to go through some layers. Your spinal cord is very deep in the body, surrounded by lots of layers of protection. For one, if I wanted to see your spinal cord, I would have to cut through the bones of your spine, all those vertebral bones. Remember, you find the spinal cord in the vertebral foramen of your vertebral bones. So I would have to saw through those bones if I wanted to get out the spinal cord. And not only that, once I pull the spinal cord out of that vertebral canal and look at it, like most other organs in your body, it's going to be surrounded by connective tissue. There are lots of connective tissue coverings to the spinal cord, multiple layers of this connective tissue covering. We call that your meninges. You might have heard of something called meningitis. When you get meningitis, you're really getting inflammation of these connective tissue coverings. You're getting inflammation of the meninges, usually due to things like infections. And then there's one more layer of protection I would have to get through to actually get to the spinal cord. So actually, after I cut through your skin, cut through muscles, saw through bone, there's one more thing around your spinal cord. It's fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. Remember in chapter 12, we talked about neuroglial cells. Remember there's a neuroglial cell that makes cerebrospinal fluid. Remember that's the ependymal cell. And the reason why they're making cerebrospinal fluid, or at least one function of it, is to provide protection. Kind of think your spinal cord is practically floating in that vertebral canal. It's floating in the cerebrospinal fluid. So these are all things I'm going to have to get through to get to the spinal cord. Why? Because they're all there for protection. Bones, meninges, and even fluid. And I mentioned the meninges. On this slide, we're going to get a better up-close picture of these connective tissue coverings to the spinal cord. Like usual, I want you to know your three major connective tissue coverings in order. That's what we're looking at here. We see the three major layers of your meninges, the three major connective tissue coverings. There's something called the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Say mater like alma mater, not matter. And so on your slide, it's listing them in order. The most superficial layer covering the spinal cord is what we call the dura mater. And on the picture in the diagram, you can see it's this most superficial layer that's kind of grayish in the cartoon. That's your dura mater. It's a thick outer layer of connective tissue. And if you were to peel back or reflect back the dura mater like they do in the image, well, then you'll find another layer deep to it, underneath it. It's the layer in the middle we call the arachnoid mater. And it's called arachnoid for spider because when you look at this layer, it kind of looks like a spider's web. And so it's this on the cartoon like usual. It's this slightly pinkish purplish layer. That's your arachnoid mater. Again, it's just connective tissue there for protection. And yet one more time, if I were to reflect back this layer, peel back this layer, I'll see the innermost layer to your meninges. It's called the pia mater. This is the innermost layer. It actually touches the spinal cord. In most cases, it's almost like it vacuum seals itself to the spinal cord. It's really hard to peel off the pia mater without damaging the spinal cord. But again, they're all there for protection. Make sure you know your three meningeal layers in order from most superficial layer to deepest layer. And that's what you see on this slide. Outermost layers, the dura mater. Middle layers, the arachnoid mater. And the innermost layer, touching the spinal cord, is the pia mater. So once you peel back all those meningeal coverings and you look at the spinal cord, then we could begin to define some spinal cord features. One thing I want you to know is, where does your spinal cord begin and end? Well, you might know where it begins. Let me give you a hint. It's coming off as an extension of the last part of the brainstem. Oh, what's the last part of the brainstem? We'll see it when we do brain. It's something called the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata is just the last part of your brainstem. And it will continue on down as the spinal cord. It's just an extension of the medulla. And your spinal cord doesn't actually go all the way down your spine. It actually stops a little short. Turns out the spinal cord usually ends around the level of your L2 vertebral bone, your second lumbar vertebra. So what else is going down the rest of your lower back? What's going down the rest of your lumbar region in your spine? Well, you can see from the picture on this slide, it's just a lot of nerves. It's a collection of nerves we call the cauda equina, meaning horse's hairs. Because the person who saw these little nerves towards the bottom portions of your spine thought they looked a little like horse's hairs. In my opinion, it looks more like angel hair spaghetti. But that's the cauda equina. It's just this collection of nerves after the spinal cord has come to an end. And why is it important to know this stuff? Well, like usual, we could take advantage of it. If you've ever delivered a baby or know someone who has, one thing a female might get to help numb the pain, so to speak, is called an epidural. And if you've ever seen or had an epidural performed on you, they always seem to put it in the same spot, always in the lower back. Why? Well, the epidural is numbing medication, and you don't want to inject it too high up in the back because it might actually pierce the spine, and then you might have some issues like paralysis in your patient. So to make sure they avoid the spine, they always go down to at least the L2 region where we know the spinal cord has come to an end. That way, if I inject my needle, I know I won't hit the spinal cord. And if you're wondering, how can I tell where approximately my L2 region is? You can see from the picture, it's usually at the top of the hips, right where the iliac crest is. If you go towards the spine, that's usually around your L2, L3 lumbar vertebra areas. And if you pierce the lower back in that region with an epidural, you'll be able to avoid the spinal cord. So you can see, again, spinal cord begins as an extension of the medulla oblongata, and it ends around your L2 lumbar vertebra. And then after that L2 lumbar vertebra, it's just going to be a collection of nerves we call the cauda equina. So now you know some external anatomy, kind of how it begins and ends. And so we could begin to look inside the spinal cord. And that's what you see in this image. They've cut open the spinal cord in a cross section, or what we call a transverse section. And you can see right off the bat something about spinal cord anatomy. I'm seeing the periphery of the spinal cord looks a little light. And in the middle, more interior portions of the spinal cord, you see this darker H-shaped or butterfly-shaped area. One looks dark, almost grayish in real life. One looks lighter, almost whitish. You're seeing where there is gray and white matter. Remember, gray matter is just where you have unmyelinated neurons. So they're going to send information slightly slower. And then the lighter areas, remember those were white matter, where you had myelinated neurons, which are going to send information a lot faster. So right off the bat, just by looking at this picture of the spinal cord, I see all the lighter areas, places like your posterior columns or your anterior white columns. That's white matter. That's why they even have white in the name. You have an anterior white column and a posterior white column. You're just seeing where there's white matter. So you know the edges or the peripheries of the spinal cord are sending information rather fast. While that little butterfly-shaped or H-shaped darker region, that's your gray matter. That's where you have some unmyelinated neurons, and they're going to send information possibly a little bit slower. But let's break down some of this anatomy. Let's name some parts to this interior anatomy of the spinal cord. Go back and look at that H-shaped middle, that butterfly-shaped middle. Well, it's not really an H. It's not a butterfly. What you're seeing are projections from this central region, and they kind of look like pointy little horns. You notice there were two towards the front and two towards the back. Oh, how can you tell front from back? Oh, that's super easy. You see it on the picture. The front portion of the spinal cord, the anterior portion of the spinal cord, has a deep groove in it. In anatomy, we usually call deep grooves fissures. And this is a deep groove or a fissure in the front of the spinal cord, and it's right in the middle. So guess what we're going to call it? It's called the anterior median fissure. The anterior median fissure, it tells you in the name, is on the anterior portion of the spinal cord. So if you see that deep groove, anterior median fissure, you're looking at the front of the spinal cord. The back of the spinal cord does not have a deep groove in it. So it's pretty easy to tell front from back. And so let's look at those two pointy projections, those two dark pointy projections towards the back of the spinal cord. You have two of them. You see one on each side, forming the kind of left and right halves of this little H or butterfly, pointing towards the back. Those are what we call your posterior horns. Remember, I told you they look kind of pointy like a horn. So we call them your posterior gray horns, or you could just call them posterior horn, or you could call them your dorsal horn. Remember, dorsal and posterior mean the same thing. While the two pointy projections towards the front, same side as the anterior median fissure, well, those two pointy projections in the gray matter are your anterior gray horns. Or you could just call them anterior horns or ventral horns. So that's what you're really looking at when you look at this dark H-shaped or butterfly-shaped portion of the spinal cord. You're just looking at the two posterior horns in the back, the two anterior horns in the front, and there are also two horns pointing laterally, but they're extremely small. They look like very subtle bumps off to the sides. We call them the lateral gray horns. You have one on each side. So that's what your gray matter structure is broken up to. Posterior horns in the back, anterior horns in the front, and lateral horns on the side. And remember, all these structures are here for a reason. Remember, every anatomy has a physiology. There's a reason for them. Turns out they're carrying different types of information. Turns out the posterior horns are typically carrying sensory information, while the anterior horns are typically carrying motor information. I want you to know that. Posterior or dorsal horns carry sensory information, while anterior, or sometimes called ventral horns, carry motor information. Keep looking at the spinal cord. You see these yellow things off to the sides. You see them branching off from the horns. Turns out those little branches you see coming off the horns, those little extensions, are what we call roots. And if you're coming off the dorsal horn, the posterior horn, the horn in the back of the spinal cord, well, we're going to call you the posterior root. While the branch, the yellow branch coming off towards the front, is called the anterior root. They're carrying the same information as the horn. So both your anterior horn and anterior roots are carrying motor information, while the posterior or dorsal horns and dorsal roots are carrying sensory information. And there is a slightly easy way to tell anterior root from posterior root. It's because of something you see only in the posterior root. It's a little bulge. You see it in the picture. The back half of those branches has a little bulge to it. That's where you're going to see a large collection of neuron cell bodies. In anatomy, we call a collection of neuron cell bodies a ganglion. So your posterior root has what we call a posterior root ganglion. It's the bulge you see in the picture in that yellow little branch coming off the spinal cord. You only have a root ganglion in the posterior root. There is no bulge. There is no ganglion in the anterior root. And then towards the end, you see both the anterior root and posterior root merge together. And when they merge together, yet again, their name is going to change. When these two roots merge together, posterior and anterior, they form what we call a spinal nerve. That's all the nerves you see coming off the spinal cord on the previous pictures. Those are spinal nerves. They're they're made up of both anterior root contributions and posterior root contributions. So you know something about spinal nerves already before we even get to them. Turns out spinal nerves are what we call mixed nerves, meaning they're carrying both motor and sensory information. Why? Because it's the result of merging the anterior root, which carries motor information, with the posterior root, which is carrying sensory information. So when they merge together, that spinal nerve is carrying both motor and sensory information. And so with that, we got to look at nerves, And on this picture, you're just seeing a real anatomical section of the spinal cord. It gives those color references a little bit more meaning. Again, the more peripheral portions, that's looking lighter, almost white. That's your white matter. And the central portion showing, again, that little H-shaped area or butterfly-shaped area. That's your gray matter. And again, even on this picture, I see towards the bottom of the screen, that's the front half. How do I know? Because I see the deep groove. I see the anterior median fissure. And towards the top of the slide, that's actually the back. Why? Because there's no deep groove there. So you could actually pinpoint the dorsal horns and anterior horns on this picture too. But like I mentioned, we got to look at some more spinal cord anatomy and then get into some nerves. And you kind of got a lot of spinal cord anatomy, so we could actually start to talk about some physiology. Remember, one major function of the spinal cord is really to send information to and away from the brain. Remember, spinal cord is basically a highway for information. And you kind of knew from the beginning of the chapter, you're either sending sensory information to the brain or motor information away from the brain. And to do that, you actually kind of send this information in different areas. We already know dorsal horn is carrying sensory, anterior horn is carrying motor. But we name the pathways for this information. The pathways for this information are what we call tracts. And you can see on this slide, there's something called the descending tract, sometimes called the motor tract. And there's something called the ascending tract or sensory tract. They tell you in the name. The motor tract, remember motor is you stimulating muscles. So this is you sending motor information. And I already mentioned before, you send motor information away from the brain. And the brain's up top. So when you're sending information away from the brain, it has to go down the spinal cord. So we say the motor tract, this pathway for sending motor information, is a descending tract. You're going down away from the brain. While your ascending tract, your sensory tract, again, it tells you in the name, is carrying sensory information. And you know already, you're sending sensory information to the brain. And again, the brain's up top. So if you want to send sensory information to the brain, it has to climb up the spinal cord. It has to ascend the spinal cord. So like usual in anatomy, we name everything. We even name the pathways in which we send information. Descending tract, aka motor tract, is you sending motor information away from the brain towards your muscles. Or your sensory tract or ascending tract is you sending sensory information up to the brain. So that's a little bit more hints on the physiology of the spinal cord. But again, I got to talk about the nerves, those little branches coming off of the spinal cord. Turns out you have a lot of spinal nerves. Turns out you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. 31 nerves coming off the right side and 31 nerves coming off the left. And remember, each of these spinal nerves is made up of a merge or a fusion of an anterior and posterior root. So all of your spinal nerves are carrying both motor and sensory information. All of your spinal nerves are what we call mixed nerves, meaning they're carrying both motor and sensory information. And they will do this to all the different parts of your body. And like usual, we got to break down some anatomy of a nerve then. We know what other things look like muscles and bones. Oh, what about a nerve? Turns out, like usual, if you want to build a nerve, it starts off with cells. In this case, it's the major cell of your nervous system. It's neurons. But a nerve is only a certain part of your neuron. Turns out your nerves are really the axons of your neurons. So if I want to build a nerve, I need to get lots of axons. And I need to bundle them together. Kind of very similar to how we bundled all the cells in a muscle together. Oh, let's refresh on muscles. Remember in a muscle, around a single cell is endomysium. Around a collection of muscle cells or a fascicle is perimysium, and around the entire muscle is epimysium. Your nerve has connective tissue coverings very similar to muscle. And it's so similar, their names are actually going to be similar. Remember, there was endomysium in muscle, perimysium in muscle, and epimysium in muscle. Well, there are also 3 connective tissue coverings for your nerves. And just like for muscles, for nerves, I want you to know the 3 connective tissue coverings and what are they covering. And for nerves, the name is similar. There is endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium. Neurium in this case is now for nerves, for neurons, for nervous system. While mesium, when we did muscles, was for muscles. So you kind of already know what they're going to cover based off our muscle connective tissue coverings. But again, we'll take our time and we'll look at this image as we go through it. So first up, to make a nerve, remember it's going to begin with axons. And just like how you had to have connective tissue around an individual muscle cell, well, you're going to need connective tissue around an individual axon, a single axon. The connective tissue that covers a single axon is called endoneurium. It surrounds a single axon. And then to build the nerve, I need to add axons together. I need to bundle them together. I need a collection of cells yet again. I need a fascicle. Remember, a fascicle is just a collection of cells. In this case, it's a collection of axons of different neurons. And to hold all these axons of different neurons together, again, I'm going to need connective tissue. This is, again, connective tissue surrounding a fascicle, in this case, a collection of neuron axons. It's called perineurium. Perineurium is the connective tissue that surrounds a fascicle or a collection of axons. And then to build the entire nerve, you just get a whole bunch of fascicles and you hold them all together, and you'll wrap the entire nerve with connective tissue. And the connective tissue covering for the entire nerve is what we call epineurium. So you have 3 different connective tissue coverings for your nerves. Endoneurium, surrounding a single axon. Perineurium, surrounding a fascicle, aka a collection of axons. And epineurium, surrounding the entire nerve. So basically, you build a nerve very similar to how you build muscle cells. Just get our muscles. Get a whole bunch of cells and hold them together with connective tissues. So now you know some basic anatomy of your nerves as well. And you might recall from lab, we saw in labs the spinal cord, and there are actually little gaps we saw on the sides of the spinal cord. Remember, we called those the intervertebral foramen, and I told you that's where spinal nerves are coming through, where nerves coming off the spinal cord are coming through. But you can see something else in this picture. You see the spinal nerves exiting laterally through those intervertebral foramen, but as soon as they exit, they split. If you notice from the picture, it's like the spinal nerve splits, sends a little strand towards the posterior region of the spine, and sends little branches towards the anterior region. Like always, we name everything. We name these branches off the spinal cord. We call them your rami. They're just branches of nerves off the spinal cord. That's all. Remember, stick to the exam review. So what do I really want you to focus on? Well, remember, if you recall a couple of slides back, I told you have 31 pairs of nerves. Oh, that's a lot of nerves. And you know by now in anatomy, when there's a lot of something, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to classify them. And when we look at the spinal cord and all the spinal nerves, we break them up into different groups, collections of spinal nerves we call plexuses. Like usual, I want you to know something. I want you to know your different plexuses. Plexuses is plural, plexus is singular. I want you to know your different plexuses. What spinal nerves make up the plexus? I want you to know a specific nerve or 2 in each plexus and what that specific nerve does. So make sure you know the plexus, what spinal nerves form that plexus, and know a specific function of a specific nerve in that plexus. Stick only to the ones we're about to mention. Like always, trust your exam review. So what are the different plexuses coming off the spinal cord? What are the different collections of spinal nerves? Well, they actually have names similar to regional terms. So just by naming the plexus, you actually might know where to find the nerves that are coming off the spinal cord. There's the cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and sacral plexus. Know these 4 plexuses, what spinal nerves make them up, and know the function of specific nerves in that plexus. Trust your exam review. So let's go through them one by one, starting off with the cervical plexus. And I told you, it tells you in the name where to find the nerves coming off in this region. It's called cervical. Remember, that was the regional term for neck. So a lot of the nerves coming off your spinal cord in your neck are going to make up what we call the cervical plexus. So which nerves? Remember, you got to know what spinal nerves form it. And before I tell you, let me just mention how we name spinal nerves briefly. It's super simple. It's very similar to how we name the vertebral bones. It's a letter and a number. And the letter in this case is the name of the plexus, and the number is just your position in that plexus. And so you can see from this picture off to the right, your cervical plexus is made up of spinal nerves C1 through C5. I want you to know that. Cervical plexus is made up of spinal nerves C1 through C5. And then I told you you need to know a specific nerve and its function in this plexus. I'm going to pick one out. It's one you see towards the bottom. It's called the phrenic nerve. Your phrenic nerve, again, you can see from the image, gets contributions from C3, C4, and C5. And the job of the phrenic nerve is to stimulate the diaphragm for breathing. Keep it that simple. Your phrenic nerve, as its function, stimulates the diaphragm for breathing. So if you were to injure your phrenic nerve, you might die from suffocation because you would literally stop breathing, because your breathing is largely thanks to the contractions of your diaphragm. And it's the responsibility of the phrenic nerve to stimulate the diaphragm to contract. So again, keep it simple. Know the plexus, know what nerves form the plexus, and know a specific nerve and its function. One more time. Cervical plexus is made up of spinal nerves C1 through C5. A specific nerve in this plexus is the phrenic nerve, and its function is to stimulate the diaphragm for breathing. That's it. So let's go on to another plexus. Another plexus, another collection of spinal nerves, is what we call the brachial plexus. It's called this because all the nerves coming off the spinal cord at this area are going to go towards the arm to help stimulate muscles in the arm and to help with sensory functions in the upper limb, in the arm. Remember, your arm is called brachial region. So because these nerves are going towards the arm, towards the brachial region, they're called brachial plexus. But again, stick to what I want you to know. What spinal nerves come off the brachial plexus? Again, you could see it in the image to the right. In this case, your brachial plexus is made up of spinal nerves C5 through T1. There's sometimes a little overlap between these plexuses. So I kind of think it's almost picking up where the cervical left off. It starts off with C5 and goes all the way to T1. And I'll pick out 2 specific nerves in this plexus. There's something called the radial nerve, and there's something called the ulnar nerve. Their names sound so familiar, radial and ulnar. Those sound similar to bone names in your forearm. Remember, pinky side in your forearm, medial side is pinky side. Remember, that's your ulnar bone. So there's going to be a nerve going closer to the pinky side in your forearm. That's your ulnar nerve. Goes to the same side as the ulnar bone. And remember, in your forearm, there was the radius bone, which was lateral, which is thumb side in your forearm. So there will be a nerve going closer to the radius bone, more thumb side. That's the radial nerve. But again, I want you to know their function. So what's a function of the radial and ulnar nerves? Let's do radial nerve first. Turns out radial nerve provides motor and sensory functions to fingers 1 through 3 and half of finger 4. Yes, that's a function. Function of radial nerve, or at least one function, is to provide motor and sensory information to fingers 1 through 3 and half of finger 4. Same side, half that's on the same side as fingers 1 through 3. And then your ulnar nerve is doing the same thing for finger 5 and half of finger 4. Ulnar nerve can provide motor and sensory function to your pinky finger and half of your ring finger. So that's brachial plexus. Brachial plexus is made up of spinal nerves C5 through T1. It contains the radial nerve that allows you to sense on fingers 1 through 3 and half of finger 4, and the ulnar nerve that allows you to feel finger 5 and half of finger 4. So that's brachial plexus. So if you're ever sitting at home and you notice your pinky starts to go numb, it's because you're squeezing or pinching your ulnar nerve. You got to lift up your elbow, get it off the table or your lap, kind of stretch out your arm a little bit. You might need to ice the elbow because that's where usually people tend to pinch their ulnar nerve. Now you know. But again, keep going, lots of plexuses. Again, in this picture, you're just seeing the full pathway for the brachial plexus nerves. Like I mentioned, you'll have nerves like your radial and ulnar nerves going all the way to the finger. So think of brachial plexus as allowing you to feel and move basically your upper limb. But let's move on to the lumbar plexus. And like usual, it's made up of spinal nerves. Turns out the lumbar plexus is made up of spinal nerves L1 through L4. Sometimes L5, depending on your source. But if I ask on your exam, you can keep it simple. Say L1 through L4. And then, like usual, you got to pick out a specific nerve in this plexus. I'm going to mention one. It's called the femoral nerve. Again, this is a nerve, so it is a mixed nerve. It's a spinal nerve, or at least getting contributions from spinal nerves. So it's carrying both motor and sensory information. Turns out your femoral nerve, as its function, is to provide motor and sensory information to the anterior thigh. So that means you can feel the front of your thigh thanks to your femoral nerve. That's the sensory function. And you could control a lot of the muscles in the front of your thigh. Remember, a large group of muscles in the front of your thigh are called your quadriceps femoris muscles. Turns out you get to control them, mainly, thanks to your femoral nerve. So that's lumbar plexus. And that's what you're also seeing on this picture. It's going down into the thigh, mainly the front of the thigh. And again, lumbar plexus is made up of spinal nerves L1 through L4. One particular nerve in this plexus is the femoral nerve, which provides motor and sensory function to the anterior thigh. That's lumbar plexus. And the last plexus on our list is called the sacral plexus, because it's in the sacrum. Nerves are coming off in the sacral region. And again, what are the spinal nerves? Well, in this case, it's picking up where lumbar plexus left off. It's going to begin with L4 and go all the way to S4. Actually, it's, in most cases, the references say L5. So if I were to ask on your exam, sacral plexus is made up of spinal nerves L5 through S4. L5 through S4. And again, we got to pick out one nerve. There is a huge nerve in this plexus. It's huge. You see it on the picture. It's called the sciatic nerve. Again, you got to know the function. What's the function of the sciatic nerve? Well, it turns out the sciatic nerve is going towards the back of the thigh. It's going to the posterior thigh. It's basically doing for the posterior thigh what the femoral nerve did for the anterior thigh. Your sciatic nerve provides motor and sensory function for the posterior thigh and even the leg. That's the sciatic nerve. It provides motor and sensory function for the posterior thigh and leg. So that's your different plexuses. One more time for the sacral plexus. It starts off from spinal nerves L5 through S4. One particular nerve is the sciatic nerve, and its major function is to provide motor and sensory function to the posterior thigh and leg. So that's your plexuses. Know the plexus, know what spinal nerves form the plexus, and know your specific nerves and their functions. So now you even know about some physiology about nerves. And again, this picture is showing you sacral plexus kind of territory, more posterior thigh going all the way down into the leg. And so if you kind of think about it, based off these different plexuses and the different spinal nerves, you kind of know where each nerve helps to supply. And like usual, we could take advantage of our anatomy knowledge. Turns out we take advantage of it by forming little sensory maps. A sensory map depicting where different areas of your body are kind of monitored sensory-wise by a spinal nerve is what we call a dermatome. A dermatome is what we call a sensory map. It's a map of the body showing you which spinal nerves allow you to feel in which parts of the body. And that's what you're seeing on this picture here. You're seeing a dermatome map. You're seeing a map of all the different areas in the body, and you can see which nerves help you to feel in that area. For example, if your shoulder, the top of your shoulder were to go numb, well, I would tell you to go get your C4 spinal nerve checked out, because your C4 spinal nerve allows you to sense on the top of the shoulder. Or on the other hand, if maybe your pinky finger went numb, yes, you could check your ulnar nerve, but the problem could be higher up in the C8 spinal nerve. So remember, doctors aren't super special. They just know a lot of anatomy. So now you know, if you ever stub your pinky toe and it hurts, oh no, life's over again because you hit your pinky toe. Now you know you could thank spinal nerve S1 for sending that information to your brain to let you know you're in pain. So that's all your neurologist is doing. When you come in and you're saying, I'm having some pain, they ask where, and they know this dermatome map by heart, and they could kind of figure out if possibly a spinal nerve is the cause for the pain, or in some cases, numbness. So that's a little bit on some anatomy of both your spinal cord and the nerves coming off. And to finish this chapter, we just go right back again to some more spinal cord physiology. Again, we're dealing with the spinal cord being a highway for sending information to and away from the brain. And we already know your spinal cord is made up of both gray matter and white matter. And we know gray matter is really in that little H-shaped portion, that little butterfly-shaped area of the spinal cord, while the white matter is more in the periphery. And the white matter has myelinated neurons that will send information fast. So the white matter, the outer portions of the spinal cord, are really going to be involved in sending and receiving information to and from the brain. While the gray matter, those central areas, they're a little bit slower in processing. So it turns out your gray matter is doing a lot of some integrations, doing a lot of some analysis. Think your reflex breakdown, your reflex processing information. That's a lot of what your gray matter is going to be involved in. But like usual, what do I want you to know? I told you the spinal cord is like a highway for information, and in some cases we can name the pathways for information. Remember, these pathways are what we call tracts. I want you to know the different tracts in the spinal cord and what information are they carrying. Remember, stick to the exam review. I'm going to mention a couple. Stick to your exam review. And we see a lot of these tracts on this picture. And to kind of help us organize things, they use some color coding. All the different areas in blue are sensory tracts, so they're going to be carrying some type of sensory information. While the red areas in this picture are carrying motor information. They're motor tracts. They're part of the descending pathway. So let's pick out some specific tracts and talk about what specific information they're going to carry. Let's start off with the sensory tracts in blue. For example, towards the back of the spinal cord, posterior part of your spinal cord, where there's no deep groove, remember that's the back, there's something called the posterior columns. And we break up the posterior columns into two segments. There's the gracilis or the gracile fasciculus, and there's the cuneatus fasciculus, sometimes called the cuneatus. But I'm just going to mention them as a whole, called the posterior column. So know it as the posterior columns. So what type of sensory information is the posterior columns carrying? Turns out your posterior columns carry two types of sensory information. I want you to know these two types of sensory information the posterior columns are carrying. One is for vibration. It carries sensory information for vibration. So when your phone vibrates in your pocket, you could feel the vibration thanks to your posterior columns processing that information and sending it on up to the brain. And it carries another type of information. It carries what we call proprioception. Proprioception is your body's ability to tell where body parts are in space. That is proprioception. It's your body's ability to tell where body parts are in space. Proprioception, just in case, is spelled Proprioceptors. CORS. That's proprioceptors that are doing proprioception. And they're located in the posterior columns. So, for example, you could close your eyes, and if I asked you to touch your chin, you could do it without looking, or touch your nose, or your ears, or your elbows, or your knees. You could touch the different parts of your body without looking. Why? Because you know where they are in space. Why? Because you have proprioception. It's your body's ability to tell where body parts are in space. Your posterior columns do that. So know the two types of information your posterior columns are carrying: vibration information and proprioception information. Let's look at one more sensory tract. It's towards the front. That little blue area towards the front is called your spinal thalamic tract. It's more anterior, but it's still a sensory tract. And again, it's carrying sensory information, and we got to be specific. What specific type of sensory information is your spinal thalamic tract carrying? Yet again, it's carrying multiple types. It's carrying two major types of sensory information. Your spinal thalamic tract carries pain and temperature information. Pain and temperature. So yet again, when you stub your pinky toe and it hurts, again, you're sending that pain information to your brain using your spinal thalamic tract in the spinal cord. And at the same time, if you touch a hot stove, you can feel the heat of that hot stove. Then, thanks to your spinal thalamic tract, it carries pain and temperature information. So know those two sensory tracts: posterior columns for vibration and proprioception, and spinal thalamic tract for pain and temperature information. Then we're going to look at one motor tract, just one. And again, it's closer to the front of the spinal cord. It's called your corticospinal tract. This is carrying motor information. Thankfully, there's no breakdown for motor information. That's it. Corticospinal tract carries motor information. Period. So know those tracts. One more time: posterior columns carry vibration and proprioception information. Spinal thalamic tract carries pain and temperature information. And your corticospinal tract carries motor information. There are other tracts. Trust your exam review. Remember, I'll only ask about this exam review. And then to finish off this chapter, the last thing we talk about, again, still related to spinal cords, is one more function. Remember, one major function of your spinal cord is the processing of reflex information. So we got to talk about reflexes. I want you to know, what is a reflex? Well, simply put, you see the definition on this slide. A reflex is a fast, predictable, automatic response to an environment. It's predictable that if you touch a hot stove, you will quickly, automatically move away. That response to you touching a hot stove is a reflex. Or the other one I mentioned earlier in the chapter, when you're at the doctor and they tap your knee, it's predictable that you will quickly, automatically kick out with your leg. These are reflexes. It's just a fast, predictable, automatic response to a stimulus or a change in the environment. And then again, it's thanks to your spinal cord processing this information for you. So we gotta look into it. How does your spinal cord process this sensory information? For one, your spinal cord is gonna get a signal. It's gonna have to think about it, and it's gonna have to give out a response. That sounds a lot like how we maintain homeostasis. Oh boy, we're going way back to chapter 1. Way back to homeostasis, way back to positive and negative feedback loops. This is very similar. Think back to your feedback loops. Remember, there were different players or variables involved. Remember, we're responding to a change. Remember, a change in an environment is called a stimulus. And in order for us to notice there's a change, we need something to detect the stimulus. Remember, the thing that detected the stimulus was the receptor. But you remember, in lots of cases, the receptor can't do anything but receive that information. Remember, it needs to send it to the control center to process the information and come up with a plan. And then the control center had an effector to do the plan, to give you the result. So you're going to see a lot of those same key players here when we talk about a reflex. And that's what you're seeing in this picture here. And it's numbered nicely in order to show you the pathway that you're going to send this information and who's involved. So there's 5 major players involved. And again, we're talking about a reflex, a response to a stimulus, a response to a change in the environment. So let's say you're at home, you're cooking, and you accidentally touched that hot stove. Well, for one, you need to know the stove is hot. You need to sense that hot stove. That's the job of the sensory receptor. So in your skin, you have receptors to sense temperature changes. If you were to touch a hot stove, sensory receptors will notice. But those receptors in your skin can't hop out of your body and turn off the stove for you. They need to send the information on to the next player involved in this scenario. It's going to be a neuron. It's going to be a neuron that's going to carry that sensory information. You remember, neurons that carry sensory information are called sensory neurons. So your sensory receptors, as soon as they detect the stimulus, they will send that sensory information using a sensory neuron. And that sensory neuron is going to send the information to the integrating center, which is basically the control center. And in this case, the integrating center is your spinal cord. So your spinal cord is the integrating center. Your spinal cord will process that information and come up with a response. But again, your spinal cord can't hop out of your body and push you away from the hot stove. It needs to send the information on to something that can do something about it. And in this case, you know what's going to happen. You know when you touch your hot stove, you're going to move away. And you know the process of moving is the job of muscles. So you got to get this motor information to your muscles. You remember what type of neuron sends motor information? Well, it's your motor neuron. Your motor neuron will send that motor information from the spinal cord to your muscles, which will move you away. And your muscles are doing the work. Your muscles are doing the response. Your muscles are the effector in that case. So these are the typical parts to a reflex arc, or to a reflex. It's the sensory neuron detecting the stimulus. It's the sensory neuron sending the sensory information to the spinal cord. It's the integrating center in the spinal cord that's processing the information and developing a response. It's the motor neuron sending the motor information. And it's the effector, which in most cases is your muscle, that will do the response. So those are the parts to a reflex arc. One more time: sensory neuron, sensory receptor, sensory neuron, integrating center, motor neuron, and your effector. Those are the parts to a reflex arc. And to finish off reflexes, we look at a particular reflex up close. There are also lots of other terms involved in reflexes. That's what you're seeing on this slide here. Just a lot of vocabulary terms. You do not need to know these. Remember, stick to your exam review. I'll just mention at least the first two. There's something called ipsilateral and contralateral. Remember, you do not need to know this. I'm just explaining because it's here. To be ipsilateral means you're on the same side. So some nerves, when they come off your spinal cord, will go and stimulate muscles or other organs on the same side of the body, For example, there are some spinal nerves that come off the right side of your body that would go to organs on the right side. Same side is ipsilateral. Contralateral means opposite sides. So these are just vocabulary terms. Like usual, trust the exam review. What I want you to know is one example of a reflex. It's what we call your patellar reflex. And your patellar reflex, it tells you the name, patellar for patella, which is in your knee. This is when you kick out when a doctor taps your knee. That's your patellar reflex. And your patellar reflex is what we call a specific type of stretch reflex. Why? What's going on? You can see your patellar reflex on this picture. So again, let's use those players of your reflex arc to help explain why you kick out when the doctor taps your knee. And by the way, your body's response to these stimuli is not a true response. Your body doesn't really know what's happening outside. All right? It's just responding to what it's sensing. So when a doctor taps your knee, your body doesn't really know you're safe in the office and a doctor is tapping your knee. For all your body knows, you could be swimming in an ocean right now and a shark is chomping on your leg and you need to kick away to escape. This is just a reflex. This is just your body being cautious to prevent injury. So let's walk through it anyway. Let's see what happens when a doctor taps your knee. Well, when a doctor taps your knee, they're really tapping your patellar ligament. Your patellar ligament. Remember, that's a ligament that attaches the patella to the tibia bone. And when you tap it, it's going to stretch a little bit. And your body can notice the stretching. How? Well, with your sensory receptors. So that's the first step. When your doctor taps your knee, the ligament will stretch, which will actually cause the muscle to stretch as well, your quadriceps femoris muscle, and stretch receptors will notice, which are sensory receptors. And again, they're going to have to send that information. Your sensory receptors, or in this case, stretch receptors, are going to send that sensory information using a sensory neuron. And you know where it's going. It's going to send the information to the integrating center, which is your spinal cord. And your spinal cord will think about it. Your spinal cord will say, hey, I notice your patellar ligament and quadriceps femoris muscles are stretching. Something must be pushing or biting on you. You need to kick to escape. It needs to send that information to the muscle. It needs to tell the muscles to contract to get you to kick out. How are you going to send the motor information? You're going to use your motor neuron. And your motor neuron in this example will actually go right back to the quadriceps muscle. Why? Remember, how do you kick out? To kick out is to extend at the knee. Remember, knee extension is the job of the quads. So in this case, your quadriceps femoris muscle is the effector. And it will cause you to kick out, hopefully escape any injuries. That's all your body is assuming. So that's what happens when you go to the doctor. Doctor taps your knee, or in this case, patellar ligament. It will cause stretching, which stretch sensory receptors will notice. They'll send that stretch information, that sensory information via a sensory neuron to the integrating center in your spinal cord, which will process that information and develop a response, which will involve muscles. So you'll send out that motor information using a motor neuron, which will go and talk to your quadriceps femoris muscle, which is the effector to get you to kick out. So now you know about the patellar reflex. All right. And there are other reflexes. For example, you could actually get the leg to go backwards, to kick posteriorly. To do that, it's another tendon you would tap. You would tap your Achilles tendon. When you tap the Achilles tendon, that could cause someone to either plantar flex, but toes down, heels up, or possibly kick backwards. It's going to be the same thing. Stretch receptors are going to notice stretching. They're going to send information via sensory neuron. You're going to come up with a plan in the integrating center, send out the motor information via motor neuron. In this case, you're going to stimulate the hamstrings in the posterior thigh, which will cause you to flex at the knee. So there are lots and lots of reflexes. All of these reflexes, even this one here called the flexor withdrawal reflex. Withdrawal reflexes, like a lot of reflexes, are there to prevent injury. You do a withdrawal reflex when you touch a hot stove. When you touch the hot stove, or even in this case, when you step on a little pin on the floor, you're going to feel the pain, sensory receptors. You're going to send that pain information via a sensory neuron to the spinal cord integrating center, which will process the information. Then you will come up with a response, send the information via the motor neuron to your muscles to get you to pull away from that source of pain. All your reflexes, even these here called your cross-extensor reflexes, they're all helping some way to counteract something. Even if it's for something like balance, you maintain your balance when walking, partially thanks to reflexes as well. So it turns out I could test your nervous system by simply testing a reflex. That's all doctors do. When they tap you on the knee, that's just them trying to see if your nervous system is working. Because I know if I tap you on the knee and you do not kick out, well, that could be a sensory problem. Maybe your body didn't even notice I tapped you on the knee. Maybe it's a sensory neuron problem. Maybe the neurons aren't working in your nerves to send that information. Or maybe you're a spinal cord injury victim and that's just proof that your spinal cord isn't working. Or again, it's a nerve problem. Maybe it's a neuron problem in the neurons and the nerves talking to your muscle. Or maybe you have a muscle injury. Just by seeing the absence or an abnormal reflex response, I know something is wrong with one of those reflex art variables or players. So that's all we're doing. Reflexes are there to try to help prevent injuries or balance things out. And you could test the different levels simply by, or test the different functions of the nervous system simply by testing a reflex. Now you know about spinal cord and spinal nerves. That's the end to chapter 13.